Namaste and welcome everyone to our continuation, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Today we will continue our exploration on the theme of Sanskrit language with a summary first and a few questions that we received from our viewers. And I am privileged that we have Narad this evening with us and Sraddhalu. Namaste, Narad.
Namaste.
Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste. Welcome, Narad. It is so nice to have you with us always. You are the founder of this series, and your name is always associated with it. Without you, we would not be in this discussion.
Thank you.
Today we have a very important part of our discussion. In some sense, we will be concluding our study or brief exploration of Sanskrit language, but then it will be linked to one of the questions which relates to Savitri, for which Narad will share with us his views and his experience. But before we move to that, I wanted to make a quick overview of all that we have covered and its implications and a conclusion for the future. In what we covered so far, we began with the structure of the language, beginning with its sounds, and then its grammar, looked at some of the content of literature and its larger potential. Following largely Sri Aurobindo's indications, drawing upon examples, most of them gathered by Sampadanand Mishra and others, looking at some of the extraordinary work from a very superficial and distant perspective of Kapali Shastriyar under guidance of Sri Aurobindo and Ganapati Muni also. But in this, we saw the alphabet, the very base of the sounds of the Sanskrit language, which is so distinctive, so unique. It's not only comprehensive, covering all sounds, but it initiates with the descent from above of the creative vibration, which Sri Aurobindo describes passing through the 5 elements, where the creative spiritual vibration takes on a certain content of force and form, depending on the gradations through which it passes and what it gathers. And so it corresponds to an idea vibration in mind, an element of force, of life force in the vital, and translating itself into sound vibrations in the physical domain, where it aligns perfectly with the structure of the human throat and mouth. It's almost as if the human body, and in this case just the throat and mouth, are a replica of something which descends from above, or are formed as if to represent or articulate that fullness of vibration that descends from above. We saw also quite distinctively, unusually, quite different from other languages, the written letters and the pronunciation are matching. But much more important, the pronunciation and the writing matches with the idea form behind. This gives to it a certain force of self-expression, which is the basis also for the mantric power of the mantra in Sanskrit. The language itself is structured, as we saw, through root sounds, and the root sounds themselves are natural. It's not we create them, they are the resonant sounds of what we saw, the spiritual vibration, idea force, life force, and physical vibration. But from the root sounds then are the primary roots and the secondary roots that Sri Aurobindo describes, each representing a turn towards a certain direction of experience, which is both sensory as well as mental. There are both components to this. And the unfoldment of the language itself takes both forms. There's a logic or the law of the sequencing of idea experience behind, and the other has to do with the sound and the relationship of sounds, and these two go parallelly. The combinations of the secondary roots then make for the actual words, each combination modifying the first meaning, the first sense, giving it a greater particularity, narrowing, so to say, the focus of the meaning. And so the longer the length of the word, the more specific, narrow and specialized the content of its meaning, the more mentalized or physicalized it becomes. The shorter it is, the more wide, multifaceted and intuitive the sense of the meaning that it holds as well as its vibrational effect. And so the power and the psycho-spiritual force is implicit in the way the language is structured, but in the way it is unfolding also. We saw some good examples also of words. Brahman, literally in the structure of the way we make sound, with the nature of the sound sequences, aligns perfectly with the way the cosmos is created. Another distinctive feature as a consequence of this is that Sanskrit is a self-explanatory language. You can take any word that you hear, go back to its root sounds and get the sense of what the word means. Its words are self-revealing, not just in the sound on the basis of roots, but as a consequence in the intuitive import that they carry, which is the reason why we have this tradition that the mantra reveals itself, because its very content is held in the sound vibration. One of the distinctive characteristics of the language coming from this again, that you can say a lot with less words, or you can say a lot of words which narrow down an object. There's this definition of a specialist. They say a specialist is somebody who knows more and more about less and less. That is, there's a narrowing of focus and more elaboration of that content. But Sanskrit language can move into that or move back, pan out, widen out, and with just a few words say something which is quite rich and deep. And this ability of the language to be flexible, to be precise at the same time and yet flexible is quite distinctive. We looked also a little bit at the grammar and the amazing flexibility that the grammar allows, even though being in a structure which is so rational, even seemingly mathematical. But none of these laws are arbitrary. None of these rules of grammar are arbitrary. They are the natural relation of sounds and ideas. And the way these blend into each other define the rules of grammar. So you could, as if not know any rules of grammar, speak and express as would flow naturally, allowing merging and combinations as would become natural, and you'll find yourself flowing along the rules of grammar. So the rules of grammar, unlike modern languages which are quite arbitrary, the rules of grammar are actually descriptions of the natural relationships of sound and idea and sequencing of idea. As a consequence, there is a very high precision, even a mathematical precision possible in the way the language itself expresses in grammar, while at the same time allowing a huge flexibility. You can resequence words of a sentence entirely without changing the meaning of the word of the sentence. And it is this which was observed by one of the NASA scientists. 1985, he published a famous paper. His name is Briggs. It's referenced in Sampadanand's book. It's one thing which I have not really touched here, where he says that for the purpose of artificial intelligence, Sanskrit becomes the ideal language. Now this is much misused, much misunderstood, so I'm going to put it in the context in which he says this and draws this as a conclusion by showing the grammar structure of Sanskrit, where the words, nouns, adjectives are modified according to what they point to. The result is a sentence internally is cohesive in relation to other words, independent of the sequence of words. Once you understand this, there's something quite extraordinary. And the technical term is the semantic net, that is the relationship of words which forms the meaning. The semantic net is conserved in the very structure of grammar of the language, unlike any of the other modern, particularly languages. This, Briggs points out, makes it that in a normal computer, if you have a language, words or any information, you have to represent it in the memory of the computer somehow. And in representing, you of course want to minimize the wastage of memory, but you want to retain the inherent structure so that you can re-express or manipulate what is held in representation. Briggs' conclusion is that the Sanskrit language internally already holds the semantic net, and its own internal representation is held in the statement as stated in Sanskrit. What this means is, if you took any language of the world and you wanted to hold it in the memory of the computer without losing its semantic net, you would translate it into Sanskrit and retain the Sanskrit words, and inherent to the structure of the Sanskrit grammar would be the meaning held with its semantic net. So it makes it ideal. It's an optimum language for storing meaning, knowledge, information, structure of knowledge and information. This was the broad conclusion of his paper. I remember reading this perhaps in the late 80s, and it was at that time quite a breakthrough, because people never recognized that a language could have this inherent capacity to retain its meaning structure despite being shuffled around in the sequence of words. So this is one of the exceptions which you see in another characteristic of the grammar. There is also, we saw, a self-correcting tendency within the grammar structure itself, which constantly pulls back to the root principles around which the language is organized. Typically, if you watch the English language over the last 100 years, it has branched out into so many variations. There is an American English which also splits into South versus North. There's a British English which also has variations within England and within the United Kingdom. There is an Australian English, there's an Indian English, and a few other variations. And what happens is, by continual use of certain terms, they either simplify or modify in a local space, whereas elsewhere they take on different forms. There's a need for a specific use the language doesn't have. It absorbs or modifies itself. For example, if you, in the English language, you're speaking to a group of people and you tell them, I would like you to sit comfortably. When you say I would like you to sit comfortably, you is almost automatically identified with a person. So if I'm looking at someone, I would like you to sit comfortably, others think, well, what about us? So in the south of the United States, this has shifted to become you all, which has merged into a single word, y'all. I'd like y'all to sit comfortably. Now this is an improvement, because the language didn't have the capacity to distinguish between one person and many. And so it's an evolution in the language, but it's not everywhere. And after a while, the accents change, etc. Sanskrit has an inherent self-corrective tendency because of the root sounds and the natural grammar structure, that even 500 years down, what is expressed in Sanskrit will constantly lean back to its roots, constantly lean back to its underlying grammar structure, and hold its own without wandering around arbitrarily or by local variations. You will of course develop dialects which would become a different language, but it would not be Sanskrit. Sanskrit itself has this self-correcting ability and integrity, which is what has made possible for the Vedic text to still be understood today. The difference, though, is at the level at which it was expressed. It was expressed at an intuitive level. Today we try to understand it in a reduced, mentalized level. So the language is able to span from the intuitive to the mental, but our consciousness having fallen, we try to interpret on a lower level. But the language is still intact. We have lost some of the flexibility from the mentalization, but still it is there because of the inherent self-corrective tendency of the roots. And this brings us to another aspect of the language, which is it is multi-layered across worlds. If ever there could be a language which is ideal for expressing an intuitive experience, it is Sanskrit. And we have seen enough examples of this, particularly when we dwelt on the first rik of the Rig Veda. And you could see how, while superficially you can understand with the mind, as you shift it to the level of the roots, you are literally pushed back to an intuitivized state almost, or as much as you're able to get into that state, and hold the sense of the first verse and even its spiritual content as an experience in an intuitivized mind or intuitive consciousness. This ability is quite exceptional, and only because it has protected this continuum of root sounds from the higher grade to the material. So if ever there had to be a language for the intuitive mind, it would be Sanskrit, or a language for spiritual revelation, it would be Sanskrit. Sri Aurobindo, of course, did write a few things in Sanskrit. We saw that in our discussion with Sampadananda, particularly the Bhavani Bharati, which is quite an exceptional work, from what we heard from him. But to appreciate that would require us to enter Sanskrit. And I hope someday that would be possible for a larger part of humanity, or even a larger part of people in India. Until then, recognizing that large part of humanity was going to use English as a base, Sri Aurobindo himself chose, as if by circumstances, assisted by circumstances, to prepare himself equally in the English language. I don't say only. He was a master of ancient Greek, ancient Latin. He would write poetry in ancient Greek at the age of 14 and 15. It shows you he could have just as well expressed everything he wanted in ancient Greek or in Sanskrit or perhaps in French or whatever. He chooses English because there was a certain basis, a context, and perhaps even in the larger divine intention in things, utilization of the English language for a role which could be as a language for the world as it is currently. And therefore much of his major writings he did in English, but the mastery that he expresses of English reminds us of the nature of the extraordinary literature that exists in the Sanskrit language. Of course, only as much as the English tongue can hold, not having the same structure of root sounds. Nevertheless, to appreciate Sri Aurobindo's writings in anything in the English language, you need to go back to the etymology of the English words, to their Greek, Latin or other roots. And then you can appreciate what he is really saying, because he comes from a mind which is rooted in that consciousness. He comes from a mind which is spiritual and intuitive, and from there articulates using the root sounds and the power of root sounds through the filter of the Greek and Latin and then into the English language. So, if ever anyone could lift the English language to its highest potential in its ability or whatever it can of expressing something of the intuitive or the spiritual, that's the work Sri Aurobindo did in his writings, which is one of the reasons why people find his writings difficult. It's not about long sentences. I've heard people say things like, oh, he wrote in the old style, Victorian style, that was the style in... It has nothing to do with style. It has to do with the content that is expressed in the way most complete, most expressive in the sound quality and structure and sequence of words, as completely as the English language could capture that, and to express it with that. A sentence is long because it is capturing an idea form which is rich, complex and deep, multifaceted. If you split that into two sentences, the idea would be split into two, which you cannot. You're destroying, breaking the knowledge which is being contained in that. By splitting it, you're breaking something which should not have been split. Therefore, the length of the sentence. And what happens initially is, because we are so used to narrow, superficial operation of language or thought or consciousness, Sri Aurobindo seems difficult. Because he challenges us, forces us to deepen in the state of mind and approach a more intuitive poise of mind. And this happens as you read him, because he draws you deeper, he intuitivizes your mind if you allow that to happen. And especially in his poetry, and that will be the question which we will place for Narad, we see this happening most powerfully. And that's the importance of the text of Savitri. But you see here why Sanskrit is so effective. And had Sri Aurobindo written in Sanskrit, perhaps what would have been transmitted would have been so much more complete. But this was exactly the work he did. He translated out of Sanskrit to English, particularly with the Vedic texts and the hymns to the mystic fire. And I remind you all, as he was writing Savitri in the last, let's say 10 years, about 15 years before he left his body, at the same time he is translating the hymns to the mystic fire. Savitri and the Veda translated to English almost at the same time. Consider that in the state of consciousness in which he was living there, at that time holding the tail of the supermind, literally pulling it down, plugging it into the physical world. Okay, he brought it to the subtle physical fully, but holding that intention to bring it into the physical world. And he does not write things which are mental. He is writing things which align with this state of consciousness and this work. And that's Savitri and Hymns to the Mystic Fire translations of the Veda. Not enough people have valued the text of Hymns to the Mystic Fire. But you must understand where these come from, what they represent. So I continue with my summary of what we discussed. There we also saw a glimpse rather with Sampadanand, the enormous body of meters, rhythms, chandas, metrics, within which in the Sanskrit language there is the conscious retention of their cosmic rhythms, cosmic role, cosmic origin, and their natural origins. You remember Sampadananda gave the example of the sarpa, the snake rhythm, which is short, long, long, short, long, long. And he was giving this example, so I did a little bit of research. How does the snake move forward? His head moves forward short, and then the body slides left long, slides right long, and then again the head moves forward short, left, right, long, short, left, right. So the name of the rhythm is the rhythm or the meter of the snake movement, and then it's clusters of 4, etc. So we will perhaps get perhaps a more rich glimpse of the English meters when we discuss with Narad. So these we covered, and then we looked at some of the extraordinary content of the literature, some of the most beautiful, powerful, insightful communications, sometimes with extraordinary structure of knowledge. The horse moving on the chessboard in an 8x8 verse. As he moves, it forms a different verse with a complementary meaning, and things like that, which could not be possible if not for this nature of this language in its root sounds and in the fluidity as well as precision of its grammar. We also looked at the untranslatables. Obviously now when something is more intuitively held, its translation becomes more difficult into a language which is largely mentalized idea pieces. An intuitive word which has multiple facets cannot be easily converted into something which is a narrow little mental box. And so that's the problem here. And we saw also how sometimes very complex technical language is woven into prayers or what seems to be religious. To the archaeologists, they'll say religious. I give this particularly because when you go to Egypt, you find all these different devices which are clearly machine parts which were used to bore holes into the stone, and they don't understand what this is, so they say a religious article. That's a cover-all, catch-all word for covering your ignorance. I don't know what this is, a religious article, put it away. It's a machine for digging. So in the same way we saw many of the prayers actually contain mathematical codes, content, knowledge, or mathematics is embedded in the structure of a larger spiritual revelation. I mentioned how in the Veda we have the number of verses in the chapter correspond to the rotational period of planets around the sun, how many days they take to go around, or in the Bhagavad Gita, interestingly. This is also Subhash Kak's discovery. If you divide the number of verses, if you divide the Bhagavad Gita in number of chapters, half and half, count number of verses one side and the other, divide one from the other, you get pi to the 4th or 5th decimal place. Quite remarkable. It's not by chance, because that's the nature of the inspired thing. But it's not as if the rishi sat down and said, I will count so many verses to make the number happen. So, but also we have verses where the numbers are coded in the text itself by the conversion of sound to equivalent number by the Katapayadi system. And all of this is barely a small glimpse. We also saw sutras, how you can compact a huge body of knowledge in a few words because of the root sounds. So it's as if you take the body of knowledge, lean back into the condensation in the more intuitive state, further lean back until you get as if the core content of it formulated with a combination of sounds, package that and give this as the sutra aphorism. An English aphorism must have a mental content, but the Sanskrit aphorism can actually be reduced to pure sound content, and that becomes purely intuitive, and from there it can deploy into mental sounds. You remember the Shiva Sutras, and I recited the first few sutras. I un, Sutra 1, Ril Rik, then A on, I ouch, Hayavarat. If you just heard that, you'd say, what is this? This is nonsense. So as children, we had our teacher, Arya Vishnu Lalit, who would recite this to make us laugh, and we would go crazy laughing. And then he would tell us what's behind. What is this I un? And it's describing how two words join, and the rules by which they join when the sounds are e and u and the n, and when they come together, they have this common pattern. The second way of joining is the rilrik, and so on. So it's interesting that it can actually be reduced to something which, as a sutra, even seems to be contradictory. And they loved to play with this, because it's as if the contradiction stimulates the mind and forces you to break out of the little box and open to the more intuitive content which is behind. So all this I'm summarizing as things we have touched, explored, and that's why I've called it Exploring Sanskrit. I cannot say we have done full justice to the language, nor to any of the topics we have covered. It's just a first entry. And this is, so I just say it's a small glimpse we have had, but with this you can appreciate. That was the intent. That you should be able to appreciate tangibly in your experience the value of this language and what is contained in the language. And thereby the implication would be the potential of this language for us individually, for India as a whole, as a nation, and I would suggest for the world and perhaps even beyond. And this is the direction I hope to briefly touch now before we go to the next part of our discussion. Incidentally, last week on the 11th of November was the Sanskrit Day at the Sri Aurobindo Ashram. It's the day that the mother gave the message for the Sanskrit language, and so it's celebrated on that day by a few people who, they have programs, a few people come to watch, and characteristically, symbolic of the negligence of the Sanskrit language, this takes place in the middle of the holidays of the school. So none of the children, none of the teachers are exposed to this. And it takes place in isolation with a few people who love Sanskrit meeting, and that's about it. It's so sad, but it's also representing symbolically the condition of the language today in the public space in India also. There is a different World Sanskrit Day, which is sometime in August on the full moon by the lunar calendar, but it varies every day. So I'm coming now to the question of the Sanskrit language for India. Obviously, when India became free, political freedom only, that should have been, Sanskrit should have been chosen as the national language. The problem was, Nehru was against Sanskrit. He wanted Urdu. As a compromise, he accepted a modified Urduized Hindi, which is called Hindustani, which he tried to shove down the country as a national language. And there were many reasons for that, which had to do with his own allegiances and his the fact that he did not consider himself an Indian. He considered himself an Englishman, and I've spoken about this, I won't elaborate. But the problem was this. The people who imposed the decision on the country were hostile to the civilization itself. Dr. Ambedkar insisted it should be Sanskrit. Or most of the other leaders, including Shama Prasad Mukherjee, of course, but the name slips. They insisted it had to be Sanskrit, but it was somehow Gandhi and Nehru who imposed this. Finally, it was a kind of Hindi, but Urduized Hindi, which was imposed on the country. Naturally, it was not acceptable to all and led to further divisions. That story is longer. But the problem is, inevitably, all of these steps followed the objectives of colonization, which was to cut off the country from its roots, to destroy the whole spiritual legacy or power that is behind the civilization, legacy of the rishis, but the power which is behind the civilization had to be cut off by you not knowing what you're speaking about. And so this agenda was fulfilled, and even today we see this great difficulty in bringing back the full force of Sanskrit. And you read the last time the text of the mother who says, as every language, as every country has its language, India should have Sanskrit. And every child in France knows French, every Indian should know Sanskrit. And that is the argument, of course, from a spiritual point of view. But the common counter to this view is a series of questions or counters which are placed by people. Oh, Sanskrit is a dying language. Why should you have your child learn one more language. What about my freedom to learn whatever language I want? Or you can't teach Sanskrit or mathematics. You can't teach science or mathematics in Sanskrit because it doesn't have the vocabulary. You need English for that. You need English to unite India because that's the one language which everybody can accept to speak. Or it's the easiest language. English is easier than Sanskrit. So why make it difficult for a child to learn a whole new language which is more difficult? Or children get bored in class. We don't even know our English well, so why should you want to learn Sanskrit all over again? And without English, India would have been backward, or the child doesn't have a future in his career if he doesn't know English. All these have been given as counter arguments. There are even arguments which will say, oh, but Sanskrit is a language of an elite, it belongs to the Brahmins, it belongs to Hinduism, you're imposing Hinduism on Christians and Muslims of India, etc. So all of these have been arguments, and there's a brilliant article written by Dr. Kalpesh Gajiwala who counters all these very logically, with very clear common sense insights. And I have put a link for this article in the description box. Please do read it. It's extremely important. But just to ensure that you do read it and in depth, I'm going to touch upon some key points which he raises with regarding this. Of course, first appreciating the characteristics of the language, and in counter to when people say that, oh, children get bored, that's simply because of how you teach a language. But children don't need to learn a language in a classroom when you grow up with it. You see, all of us learn our mother tongue of our mother, or the language we inherit, by the fact that we grow up with our parents in daily life. A baby never needs to sit in a classroom to learn language or grammar. You see the words associated, you use the words in context, the grammar structure forms in your mind. That's the only way you can learn a language. You cannot learn a language by rules. Rules are used only to clarify and make perfect what you've already learnt. And mostly you don't need to do anything after you've learned those rules. But recognize that it's not at all a question of difficulty. If rather you say English is easier than Sanskrit, no, that's not true. English is actually a far more difficult language because of the complete arbitrariness of its spelling, pronunciation, grammar structure, and a series of exceptions all over the place. This is one example which just came my way. If you were living in England, you are learning a language without thinking, without reading, and you would have your parents or relatives say they're going to this place in England. And I'm going to pronounce the place name as you would if you saw the text on a road sign. So here's a road sign with an arrow that says go this way for, I'm going to spell it out or pronounce it as you would spell it, Gloucestershire, Gloucestershire. Anyone looking at it would say Gloucestershire, right? But someone who's grown up there would look at that and say Gloucestershire. Yeah, it is Gloucestershire. I'm going to have the computer speak it out.
Gloucestershire.
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 How weird is that? You don't need to go to a classroom to learn that. You see people pointing to the sign and say Gloucestershire, you know that's how you're supposed to pronounce it. That's how you learn a language. But here's a language full of such arbitrariness that it's actually more difficult. Sanskrit is in fact far easier for the reasons we've already seen. So that part I don't elaborate. But if someone didn't know all that we have explored now, they might still think, oh, such a complex grammar. No, it's spontaneous. And about a right to be free to learn any language, certainly everyone has a right. But a country has a language which corresponds to its mind values. This was the point Sri Aurobindo makes. It expresses the soul of the country's values. And a language which expresses that must be known by all irrespective. And there's no excuse for not learning that. Just as you accept to follow the laws of a land by living there, well, here's the language. You learn a little bit at least. And if you're an immigrant to any country, you learn a little bit of the language so that you can communicate, isn't it? And it's even if at that level it must be Sanskrit. And they can learn English in addition if they want, there's no problem there. So what the mother did in the ashram school, all children here from kindergarten, we end up learning 4 languages minimum: Sanskrit, English, your mother tongue, and French. Not necessarily in that order, but so in practice, most children would know English and French much better, but they would know Sanskrit and their mother tongue equally. Now, French, for a reason which mother said, because she found it easier to transmit certain spiritual experiences in the language which she had grown up with, and it had a greater flexibility and precision than the English language. So she could transmit certain experiences more easily there. So when you read the mother speaking in French, or you hear her, it's different from the translation. And because I can read both, reading the translation, you feel as if somebody took it and mentalized it and kind of twisted it a little bit. It doesn't have the flow and directness which you feel when she speaks French. We even had people here recently, the last 10 years, who said, Mother's French is now old. It's 100 years old French. So now we will improve the French and make it more modern. No, please don't do that. I'm saying it to you, not to them. You can't help it. They have done it. It's already changed. But someday in the future, if this is put on record, hopefully somebody will go back and put it as it was, as the mother wrote it or spoke it. Because there is a transmission that's taking place. And the person who changes the language is mentalizing and reducing. So, but you understand that it's so easy. A child can easily grow up with 3 languages in India. Your mother tongue, Sanskrit as a national language, and English as an international language, if it interests you. Nothing of your career is affected. In fact, for most children, the fact that you go with all 3 would make things very easy. First of all, Sanskrit is very close to the mother tongue because mother tongue is derived from it. Sanskrit would give you a broadness and a root structure foundation, which would make English language also much more simple. So, another counter which Dr. Kajiwala gives to this argument when he says, when people say, oh, you can't learn science and mathematics, he gives examples of how there are some of the greatest scientists and mathematicians have learnt and written in their vernacular. In fact, what is not commonly known, because we hear science as taught from Europe and England, so all the great scientist names are European or English typically, or sometimes American. The reality is that there were major breakthroughs made by Russian scientists. Many of them later found by the European scientists, who then took credit for it. But Russia was at the forefront, is still at the forefront. Some of their published papers are still some of the most advanced. More recently, in the last 15 years, 20 years, China has more than caught up, and even in some areas defeated the United States elite in the sciences. But papers published in Chinese. And you have to go through a translation process if you're really interested in understanding what they're doing. And it is the same with Russia. And of course, you have papers published in Japan by the Japanese scientists, all in their vernacular, their mother tongue. Nothing prevented them from reaching excellence. Rather, the fact that you do it in the language in which you are molded makes it easier for you to think and articulate in that language and make the breakthroughs. I see this so often here. Only recently, I was interacting with somebody who's an engineer. Having done his studies in his vernacular Tamil. And as soon as he starts speaking English, you'll find he'll hesitate. And you would think that he's struggling to think. Because the struggle is actually to fit a thought pattern to what is known. There's a transition into thought pattern and it's not aligning. And then to find words and it's not aligning. So I had somebody come to translate. And the moment he could speak in Tamil, he was going rattling away. Ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. With clear stream of ideas, very well formed. The mind was so crisp and clear. He switches to English and it becomes a blur and bumping around. Now, anybody who has done their original mathematics or sciences in vernacular will appreciate this problem. When you do it and express it directly in your natural language, your mind streams and flows with the flexibility that the language offers, with the creativity of the language potential. When you switch to another which is not yours, there is always a dulling and a warping or a limiting of some kind. And much more so when there is an intuition flowing through. So The point Dr. Gajiwala makes is actually by taking shelter in the English language, we have actually handicapped the people of India. And I'm seeing this everywhere, this kind of thing. But the flow is so easy in the vernacular, they switch to English and everything is hampered. And that's effectively what it did was it reduced India to a service provider, a bunch of workers, bureaucrats, which was the objective of the English people under colonial rule, to reduce India to a nation of clerks. So one observation also which is very interesting is, if you look at all the countries today which are economically backward, not sufficiently free in their self-confidence as a nation, all of them were colonized once and have retained the colonizer's language as their mother tongue. You see this in large parts of North Africa, for example. As a result, their mindset is always held under the colonized relationship with the colonizers, even though they have become free politically. They're always subservient. They have not yet found their innate genius. And this is a very serious issue. There's a famous, Kalpesh quotes a very famous businessman, Kumar Mangalam Birla, who says that I used to respect people who could speak proper English and thought they were smarter. And then he found, as he went all over the world, he had business operations in other countries, he found people were much smarter in their vernacular, and the ability to speak English meant nothing compared to their competence within their vernacular language. So he concludes, I'm actually quoting from Kumar Mangalam Birla. He says, "It took that experience for me to respect an accountant from Rajasthan, my home state, as much as a graduate of St. Stephen's in Delhi. At one time, we even wanted to run English classes for some of our employees. Now it's not an issue in my mind. If you can get your point across, if you're adding value, if you're competent, then to hell with English." So there's also this question that India would be nowhere without English. And in fact, what you see is, before English language, India was way ahead of England. Economically, culturally, linguistically, artistically, in every field. We have the documentation of the British who come to India about 300 years ago, who take back knowledge from India, implement it there, and that becomes a breakthrough for the Renaissance in England or even in Europe. So it has nothing to do with the language itself. India reached far greater peaks without needing English. In fact, it has been the reverse after English came in. So, in fact, according to British data, when they first took over India, they were very thorough. 1835 data shows that there were 100,000 indigenous elementary schools across Bengal and Bihar alone. That was one school for every 30 children. This would be better than our current modern schooling standards. And they actually document that. They say an Indian who's just grown out of the vernacular schools in India is better educated than some of the best educated in England. These are actual quotations which you find from their records. And they had no need to fudge their records to appreciate India. In fact, they took several elements of the Indian educational system from India and established them, which became the basis for British education. And then they started a process of systematically shutting down India's universities and colleges and removing the vernacular, particularly eliminating Sanskrit first. And that's the reason why today we have this illusion that Sanskrit is an elite language. It's not. And finally, I'm just looking at Kalpesh's article. Please do read, because he goes much more in depth. You don't need Sanskrit, you don't need English for unity of India. Sanskrit rather is much better to unify. So there's no reason why it should be eliminated. So the last question is about Sanskrit being Brahmin, Aryan or Hindu language, which is often the argument given by people who come from leftists or other religious ideologies. If you take it that way, then logically you should say English is language of Christian domination and conversion, isn't it? You can't have double standards on that. So either you say English is independent of the religion in which it was used, in which case Sanskrit is independent of the context of religion or other traditions. Or you have to accept that English should be eliminated because it means it's Christianizing the whole world. So you can't go both ways. Or similarly, he gives this example, you can't say that just because Hitler gave orders in German, that German is a Nazi language. That would be stupid. So these arguments are deliberately misleading. They're meant to divide and confuse us. And you have to recognize a language is not necessarily bound to certain specific stages through which it was used. You have to look at a language from its essential roots and its essential value. And so, because you speak Sanskrit does not make you either any of these things. Language belongs to the user, Dr. Kalpesh says. And Sanskrit being the common thread, it is obviously the one thing which can unify all. In fact, it's not a dead language. In fact, it is a living language. It may not be so commonly used, but for me, it's a very easy, interesting thing to see. My mother, who has grown up in Marathi medium, who has mastered Hindi language and then come into English, her roots in Sanskrit were rock solid. How did that happen? Everybody who knew the vernacular 50 years ago also knew a little bit of Sanskrit. So it would have been very easy at that point to have activated Sanskrit as the national language. By eliminating it then and pushing everybody to shift to English, which was the goal of the colonization, it has made it harder now. But still, the reversal is easy because if you know your vernacular, Sanskrit is easy to recover from there. And so I'm going to pause here because he gives many more important insights, and I will still encourage you to read what he has to say. I will end this part of our discussion with a couple of quotations. One is of Mark Twain. Now, if you look at Mark Twain's official biography, nowhere it says that he came to India. And this is one of the reasons why his biography has been edited. You go to Wikipedia, there's hardly any reference. In fact, I found no reference 5 years ago to his visit to India. He was in India for 9 months, traveling all over the country, and wrote extensively about his experiences in India. So why would that be eliminated from his official biographies? And you get a glimpse from his quotation. I read this. He says, "This is indeed India, the land of dreams and romance, of fabulous wealth and fabulous poverty, of splendor and rags, of palaces and hovels, of famine and pestilence, of genii and giants and Aladdin lamps, of tigers and elephants, the cobra and the jungle, the country of 100 nations and 100 tongues, of 1,000 religions and 2 million gods." Now comes the part important. "Cradle of the human race, birthplace of human speech, mother of history, grandmother of legend, great-grandmother of traditions, whose yesterdays bear date with the modern antiquities for the rest of nations. The one sole country under the sun that is endowed with an imperishable interest for alien prince and alien peasant, for lettered and ignorant, wise and fool, rich and poor, bond and free. The one land that all men desire to see, and having seen once by even a glimpse, would not give that glimpse for the shows of all the rest of the world combined." Such is his praise of India, and of course the reference to English and the content of knowledge, the reference to the Sanskrit and the content of the traditions through the Sanskrit, where he says simply, birthplace of human speech. This high praise, after travel of 9 months, near about 100 years ago, let's say, is edited out from his official biography. It's to me, it's very indicative of how these agendas work. There are a couple of other very interesting quotations, and I will just read from one because it relates to the Sanskrit language. This is from the American historian Will Durant, and he writes, "India was the motherland of our race, and Sanskrit the mother of Europe's languages. She was the mother of our philosophy, mother through the Arabs of much of our mathematics, mother through the Buddha of the ideals embodied in Christianity, mother through the village community of self-government and democracy. Mother India is in many ways the mother of us all." So these are very powerful statements from people who are some of the most competent in their fields, and these should be indicators to remind us of how much is needed to be done to recover, first of all, the language, which is the mother language, and then the content which is held in the language, and thereby the potential that this language has for our minds' development and freedom, and thereby the ascent that it can offer to us into a more intuitive and spiritual domain, not only of experience but also of expression through poetry, through inspired speech and writing. That is the greatest potential Sanskrit has for us, and the English language has to struggle to come even close to that. And yet Sri Aurobindo has done something so exceptional through the English language. Imagine what he could have done in Sanskrit, has done in fact, but we can't read because we don't know Sanskrit. So this, I think, broadly covers what I wanted to share and bring about in closure of our exploration of Sanskrit. Just let me see if there's something I would still have. Yes, one last point I want to make. If you truly appreciate the structure of the Sanskrit language, then not only should it be the mother language for India, but going by what we just read from Will Durant, potentially Sanskrit could become in time a global language. Because every language, tracing back to whatever its roots, would also find affinity, if not roots, in Sanskrit itself. And so a day might just happen when this would become a global language. It may still be far, but we can look to that as a potential. Once people become conscious enough in their evolution to appreciate the value of language, to mold their mind and to open to intuitive creativity. But going a step further, which is still speculative but very logical, if ever there has to be a language that spans across planets and galaxies, it would be a language which would be the most natural from spiritual roots through mind to physical sound, which being the nature of the Deva Bhasha, the original language of the gods, of which Sanskrit is what we have retained, then this language would necessarily be recovered inevitably, simply because it's the most natural and the most universal, therefore the most eternal language for the universe across civilizations. So I think with this we close our topic of the exploration on Sanskrit, and we come to a very important question, which we...
Enzo wrote a very important question, and we will be addressing this to Narad. First of all, thanks for the talks on Sanskrit and the links to Greek and Latin. It is interesting, and I would like to ask you something more about metrics. I learned to read in Latin metrics while at school, since I had a very good Latin professor, and so I usually recognize when something is read using metrics, and my feeling is that it adds a vibration and a sort of three-dimensionality. I tried to read Savitri with a iambic meter, but I observed there's a frequent change in meter, but there are some clusters of 4, 5 verses where the meter is fairly recognizable, and you feel the pure sound force through the lines. If sung with the intrinsic meter, you experience a kind of vibrating stillness in the mind, to the point that while I was reading out loud in metrics, my wife found out that she could not read or write on her phone. And when I stopped, she recognized that it was the sound of Savitri. So why isn't Savitri read using the metrics? Since Savitri has a mantric power, as stated from the mother, the mere sound should have the power to reveal itself. What do you think about it?
So the question we will address to Narad, because first of all, you recognize Narad comes with that rich depth of the English language which is necessary to appreciate this bridge from the intuitive poetry through the language itself. Narad has dedicated his life to the dwelling in Savitri with a depth which very few people have. He has the sense of the rhythm of the poetry and what Sri Aurobindo describes in the poetry as the rhythm of the soul. And among all those that I have heard reciting Savitri, and we have heard many from the ashram and people connected, I have not found anybody else who expresses Savitri with the same force, clarity, rhythm, and transmits the power behind the lines in the way he reads it. So I'm bringing this question to Narad, but before that, just to highlight for those who might not have understood the scope of the question, what Enzo is saying that the meter itself, the iambic pentameter that Sri Aurobindo has used for Savitri, when we read consciously with that meter, it has a different effect. And he says there's a vibrating stillness in the mind and it affects people around. But when people read, normally they're not conscious of the meter. Then they don't know how to read it. And there are two ways of reading. There is the British way of reading, which is short, long, and the Indian way, which is of course common to many other old traditions. The British way is soft, loud, and the Indian or other traditions have short, long. Now the accent itself can be done by making loud or by making long, and there's a difference in effect from these two. And so all of these questions I'm going to place before Narad for why isn't Savitri read using metrics, and what is the nature of this power of the word to reveal itself when you read Savitri.
So let me first begin to speak about meter. Meter refers to the number of feet in a line. Simply that. And if we look at the different types of meter, we have trimeter, 3 beats in a line. We have tetrameter, 4 beats in a line. And many of the greatest poets, Wordsworth, for example, has written much in tetrameter. But since centuries, the most beautiful, powerful, resonant poems are written in pentameter. Penta, 5, meter. Now, this pentameter has been the choice of the greatest epic.
We couldn't hear you. Can you repeat the choice of?
The greatest epic poets of all time. And Sri Aurobindo has chosen it very consciously. Now, if we look at how to pronounce the lines in Savitri, we have to take great care to understand what pentameter and the beat is. Now, the beat is an iamb, which is the short long. Long. So if we take the first 3 lines of Savitri, it was the hour in which the gods awake. Da-da, 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 da-da. Now, if we did that through the nearly 24,000 lines, fall asleep. It's so repetitive.
Repeat that, please.
It's so repetitive. Da-da, 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 da-da. And some people read it like that.
Yes. We have heard people reading Savitri, and you go to sleep listening to that.
Exactly. So the poet has many techniques within a line while keeping the rhythm, because the rhythm is the soul of poetry that should be understood by everyone. We must understand properly rhythm. Now, we have many rhythms, such as an anapest, which is 3 beats in one. We have the same in music, 3 beats in one. So the poet can use an anapest while keeping the same meter. It was the hour before the gods awake. Now, I have studied in great depth with Amal Kiran, K.D. Sethna, and with Huta, who asked Mother, how does one read Savitri? And Mother told her, slowly and simply. Now, that doesn't mean that there cannot be inflections. Mother has read sometimes without any inflections, and at other times she's read with inflections, very strong inflections. So let me read from some of my letters to Amal and his replies. He says, read slowly. I think those first 2 words are extremely important. Some people rush through the lines of Savitri, and one loses the importance of the words. We must realize that Sri Aurobindo has brought down Savitri from the highest realms, and therefore every word is sacred. Even an article, even and the are sacred. So we cannot rush through Savitri, nor can we read too slowly. So Amal writes, read slowly with an awareness that there is a meter, i.e., long syllables, short syllables, and a combination. Meter means that there is a design, a pattern, and the fact that the poetry is divided into lines means that each line has to be felt in a certain shape. So there must be a short pause after each line, even if the sense of the line continues into the next. And this in poetry is called enjambment. If a line is enjambed, the sense of it, the meaning of it, doesn't end at the end of the line, but carries into the next line. So Amal continues. So there must be a short pause after each line, even if the sense of the line continues into the next. So, of course, when there's a full stop, there can be a slightly longer pause or a colon. But for a comma or no comma, there still has to be a very slight pause at the end of each line.
I think the intention here is to ensure we keep the rhythm, and the rhythm completes at the end of the line. With the pause, we have the next rhythm which begins.
Yes, unless it's an enjambed line.
Yes.
Okay. So Amal continues, poetry means there is meter. Meter means a certain pattern of long syllables and short syllables. It also means that each line stands by itself with a certain pause, whether long or brief. Now, when we look at Savitri, we will see that Sri Aurobindo has used many, many techniques. Now, what actually is a beat? Well, it's called an IAM, IAMB. And that beat, well, there are many of them. The one Sri Aurobindo uses in the iambic pentameter is short, long. And we have to keep that in mind. Now, I want to continue a bit with Amal because there's so much. Savitri is special in its meaning and message. It has a certain rhythm, which is at the same time like all poetry and with a subtle difference. And its special character makes it what Sri Aurobindo calls overhead poetry. That is poetry which comes from planes of consciousness above the mind. Sometimes the sense is dependent in a delicate way and with a subtle point on the way the line is read, in tune with its distinctive character. And he gives an example, a cry to clasp in all the one God hush. Now, mark the change which comes when the line is read as a cry to clasp the one God hush in all. You can feel the difference. In the first example, it is as if something is definitely said. But if one read the line as a cry to clasp the one God hush in all, it is as if in the first version, we have to discover the one God hush. In the other version, the one God hush seems a self-evident truth, and it is a truth which is not to be found, but as if it were self-existent.
So, if I understand right, the difference was the emphasis that was placed on clasping, and the other one emphasis on the one God.
Yes.
And just the fact that you tilt the emphasis shifts the meaning in the one who receives or in the impact you have as you recite.
Yes, exactly correct. Now, when Huta told me, Mother said, read slowly and with a pause, of course, we have, well, let me begin with an article I read on Sri Aurobindo's Savitri. And I quote from Sri Aurobindo, its expression aims at a certain force, directness, and spiritual clarity and reality. When it is not understood, it is because the truths it expresses are unfamiliar to the ordinary mind or belong to an untrodden domain or domains, or enter into a field of occult experience. It is not because there is any attempt at a dark or vague profundity or at an escape from thought. The thinking is not intellectual, but intuitive, or more than intuitive, always expressing a vision, a spiritual contact, or a knowledge which has come by entering into the thing itself, by identity. And therefore, we should not try to understand Savitri with our ignorant minds. The mother tells us, allow it to enter into your being. And after reading it a number of times, you will have some idea of its profundity. I would like to continue with Sri Aurobindo's writing. The philosophy of Savitri is different, but it is persistently there. It expresses or tries to express a total and many-sided vision and experience of all the planes of being and their action upon each other. Whatever language, whatever terms are necessary to convey this truth of vision and experience, it uses without scruple or admitting any mental rule of what is or is not poetic. It does not hesitate to employ terms which might be considered as technical, when these can be turned to express something direct, vivid, and powerful. We see many times in Sri Aurobindo's writing where he will use the same word twice. For example, in the synthesis, all that is he. And if you have that on your computer, you'll see that it's highlighted as incorrect because there are two is's next to each other. So in Savitri, Sri Aurobindo tells us, moreover, the object is not only to present a secret truth in its true form and true vision, but to drive it home by the finding of the true word, the true phrase, the mot juste, the true image or symbol, if possible, the inevitable word. If that is there, nothing else, repetition included, matters much.
If I can just interrupt you briefly to elucidate what the point which just was made.
Okay.
That you remember Enzo said that sometimes the meter is not always recognizable. Sometimes it's fairly recognizable, and then at times there are a few clusters where it seems to change a little bit. And this is what Sri Aurobindo is saying here, that the objective is not to stick to the meter. The objective is to transmit the experience, and if for the necessity of that transmission, momentarily the rhythm has to shift. Instead of going ta-da, 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 it goes ta-da-da, ta-da-da, and pushes hard something. It is as if hammering it, forcing it. He will do that. He will let that happen. So, or the right word in this case. The word itself might break out of the meter structure. But it's necessary in order to convey a certain force or the right word of the experience itself that's being transmitted.
He says that in the next sentence. Every word must be the right word, with the right atmosphere, the right relation to all the other words, just as every sound in its place and the whole sound together must bring out the imponderable significance, which is beyond verbal expression. So marvelous. And so we see that one can read Savitri in many different ways, but never sing-song.
Could you give an example of how it should not be done? Sing-song, I mean.
Oh, God. It was the hour before the gods awake. Across the path of the divine event, the huge foreboding mind of night alone.
I think a lot of people would recognize this. as natural to them because
Yes.
they've heard others do it in a sing-song way.
Yes, correct. I'll continue in a minute.
How would you recite these lines?
I would inflect certain words. Now, Amal does give many examples of inflection and where to inflect. And you can look on YouTube for an excellent presentation on Macbeth by one of the great actors, in which he'll tell us that you can inflect 5 different ways in a single line. And tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. So in Savitri, Sri Aurobindo says, and lastly, one has to use words and images in order to convey to the mind some perception, some figure of that which is beyond thought. And I'm always deeply moved when Mother tells us, read perhaps a line or a page or two of Savitri each day. It will help you greatly. So, to paraphrase a famous compiler, we have offered very little of anything of our own, this is mine, except the string that ties this gift of divine wisdom and promise together in a dictionary format, and that is the lexicon of an infinite mind, which will be republished soon, I hope, to help us go deeper into the vision of Savitri and the new dawns that and the new world before us. Now, there are some words that Sri Aurobindo...
May I interrupt briefly? Just to
Sure.
hold that thought. I want you to continue from there. Narad just made reference to the lexicon of an infinite mind, which is the dictionary that he created for Savitri, taking all the important words and in the way it is used in the context of Savitri, and that is his work of many years, and that's what he was referring to. Please continue.
Sri Aurobindo capitalizes many words, and they have an import that is beyond lowercase. So I asked Amal and Nolini for their understanding of capitalization. Amal told me that he believes that capitalization indicates that these are not only states, but also powers which can display even personality. And Nolini gave us an example of the word vision. When it is the supreme vision, it is capitalized. Nolini also said, when it is the personality of the thing, not only the quality of it. And then he says, there is no set rule on capitalization. But there is also many words that are naturally capitalized when they refer to a divinity representing the species. So we have the word Circean, which Nalini told me is not merely a mythological story, but a being representing universal forces. Now, another thing you're going to find in...
Just one comment on the capitalization.
Surely.
Often these are because they're personal powers, they're beings. So fire would be F capital if it is Agni. But in many cases where the word does not exist in the English language, which would represent a divine equivalent of that idea. So for example, just the word, the power of the word with a capital W would mean it's not just this spoken speech, but
Yes.
the creative vak.
Yes.
So in the Sanskrit language, we have equivalent words for things of the higher spiritual domain, which the English language does not have. And so one way to compensate is by taking the closest word and capitalizing it.
Okay, next on hyphenated words. And they are abundant in Savitri. And what do these hyphenated words mean? Well, when I spoke at length with Nolini, he said they are meant as one word, not merely adjectives. When both words in a hyphenated word are capitalized, it is to stress both elements. I'm going to read a little from a letter that Sri Aurobindo wrote to a disciple. The people in the archives have titled it Author's Note, but it never was Sri Aurobindo's note. It's just a part of a letter to a disciple. And I'm reading only the last part of it because it is so important for us to begin, at least, if not to realize, at least to have the faith that what Sri Aurobindo is telling us is true. And he goes through each of the characters, the main characters, and discusses them. But in the last sentence, he says, still, this is not a mere allegory. The characters are not personified qualities, but incarnations or emanations of living and conscious forces with whom we can enter into concrete touch. And they take human bodies in order to help man and show him the way from his mortal state to a divine consciousness and immortal life. Now, I want to say a few things about Mother on Savitri. This is not aside, this is absolutely essential. She told one of her secretaries, Savitri is a mantra for the transformation of the world. And I read Savitri as mantra. Therefore, one has to go as deeply within as possible. Invoke the presence to read through you. After all, we are not that highly evolved that we can even begin to understand fully Savitri's message. So, Mother said at one time, last night we, you and I and a few others were together for quite a long time in Sri Aurobindo's permanent dwelling place in the subtle physical, what Sri Aurobindo called the true physical. Everything that took place there, far too long and complicated to relate, was organized, so to say, express concretely the rapidity of the present movement of transformation. And with a smile, Sri Aurobindo told you something like this: do you believe now? It was as if he were evoking the 3 lines from Savitri. God shall grow up while the wise men talk and sleep. For man shall not know the coming till its hour, and belief shall be not till the work is done. So Mother has said so much about Savitri, speaking to disciples, and she says he has crammed the whole universe in a single book. It is a marvelous work, magnificent, and of an incomparable perfection. Now, even if Savitri is your second or third language, read it. Read it always. Read it with humility and gratitude. Take these lines into your inner being. If the chamber's door is even a little ajar, what then can hinder God from stealing in? Or who prevent his kiss on the sleeping soul? Mother also says, in truth, the entire form of Savitri has descended en masse from the highest region, and Sri Aurobindo, with his genius, only arranged the lines in a superb and magnificent style. Sometimes entire lines were revealed, and he left them intact. You may remember Nirod Baran's comment that towards the end, Sri Aurobindo dictated 600 lines without a change. For me, Savitri is my life. And nothing comes close to Savitri. It is the longest poem written in the English language. There is a poem, The Odyssey, by Nikos Kazantzakis, that has 10,000 more lines than Savitri, but it was written in Greek and translated into English. Imagine nearly 24 lines of mantric poetry. And it is important to understand that the rhythm is critical. It may change when you have trochees and anapaests and different techniques, but it is always iambic pentameter that we have to remember. 5 beats, and the iamb is short, long. I could go on and on. If you like, I will, but I think I've covered much of it. Savitri is a revelation. It is a meditation. Mother says it is a quest of the infinite, the eternal. And if it is read with this aspiration for immortality, the reading itself will serve as a guide to immortality. To read Savitri is indeed to practice yoga, spiritual concentration. One can find there all that is needed to realize the divine. Each step of yoga is noted here, including the secret of all other yogas. It is truly the infallible guide who never abandons you. Its support is always there for him who wants to follow the path. Each verse of Savitri is like a revealed mantra, which surpasses all that man possessed by way of knowledge. And I repeat this. The words are expressed and arranged in such a way that the sonority of the rhythm leads you to the origin of sound, which is Om. Namaste.
Thank you. It was beautiful. Thank you, Narad. I think this would be a perfect point to pause. I had wanted to share a few examples, but maybe we could keep it for another time. Just one point of clarification for a common mistake made when the mother says not to try to understand with your mind. People translate as don't try to understand it. No, that's very different. What the mother says is don't try to understand with your mind, with your surface mind. Try to understand it with a deeper range. Try to understand with your soul. Try to understand with the intuitive, etc. That would be the true sense of don't try to understand with your mind. So I would put it in different terms. Do try to understand it, but in a deeper listening. Let the words reveal the full sense and the power and the force of what is behind them, in a layer which can actually perceive what is being given and receive what is being given. But don't make the mistake to switch off your mind and mechanically repeat. That's not what is meant here. That would be a loss, a great loss. And it would not be the yoga that the mother is speaking of. It does not become a yoga when you merely repeat it or read it mechanically. It becomes a yoga when you turn with your deeper and higher listening to receive what is behind those words, which then shapes you and molds you. So such would be the nature of the mantric power in response to Enzo's question. But it's not mere sound that has the power to reveal itself. You see, Sanskrit would have the sound root as well as the force behind. But here you will recall in the passage Narad read, there is a power put behind it. That power is there irrespective of the language. And even with the English language, it is the power of Sri Aurobindo's experience and the mother's experience held. And it is that which has the power to reveal itself. It's not merely the sound. And therefore, on your part, the relationship with that power, with the presence, with Sri Aurobindo behind those words, is an essential component for you to be able to receive what he is transmitting. Then Savitri, the words, the form, even the content of the ideas, etc., become the vehicle for that power to enter, establish, and shape you. That's when it becomes a sadhana and a yoga. Let's hold this in our intention when we read Savitri, or perhaps even generally other writings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, but in this case something very distinct in the text of Savitri. And if you want to follow the suggestion that Narad has given you, perhaps read one page or some small portion every day. For some people, even one page becomes too much. Read one sentence or a few lines until your heart feels full, and then soak in, hold what is received. Not necessarily on the surface part of the mind, but a deeper listening, feeling, absorption in what was transmitted when you read. And if you choose, use the rhythm, the iambic pentameter you heard Narad reciting, and let the vibration of the mantric power therefore spread out on a material level when you read in that way, with that conscious intent, and then it would be worthwhile. So these are suggestions, and all of us can choose what works for us in our practice. Let's take a moment in gratitude to Sri Aurobindo, first of all for revealing this extraordinary power behind the Sanskrit language itself and its ability to transmit, but then bringing something of that transmission and the Vedic afflatus and something greater than the Vedic afflatus into and through the English language in Savitri. From a very practical perspective, we could say Savitri is what the Veda was then in the Sanskrit language. Savitri is in the English language for humanity today. But necessarily because it is Sri Aurobindo, the content of what was revealed then and the content of what is revealed now, there is a difference. What is necessary for the new consciousness and its development includes what was then, and now is given a wider scope of the supramental consciousness that Sri Aurobindo embodied, not merely searched for. He embodied, he lived it in his body, in his consciousness, infusing into humanity. And that comes through in his writing in Savitri. And so you can use it, if you're conscious of this, you can use this as a vehicle for relating to his presence and his power, and let him shape you and transmit his experience to you in this way. Let's take a moment to hold our aspiration and concentration in gratitude for all that we have received and will receive from Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you.